Today is the 15th of January 2004. My name is Rosa Korowska, and this interview is for the Ming-ai London Institute British Chinese Workforce Heritage Project. So could I begin by asking your name?
My name's Vivienne Lo, and my Chinese name is Lo Wei Qian. Born Lo Lian Ying.
So your married name comes?
No, I don't use my married name. So no, the issue of Chinese names you must know a little bit about. But I was born when I was born. My father gave me the name Lian Ying. Lian Ying's not a good name. He didn't really have a good way of giving children names. And my uncle protested and said, number one, it was too feminine for me. Number two, it was too common for me. And number three, it's the same name as CCHH, the Empress Dowager's evil eunuch.
Oh, really?
Lian Ying, anyway. So he gave me an academic name which you couldn't determine gender, which was based on my name, and also gave me the generation name, as each generation of Chinese families tends to have the next word in a poem, and Qian is our generation name. So I have a proper Chinese name now, but it was given to me not until I was probably 30.
Wow.
So sorry, that was a long answer to what my name is.
I think that comes with the territory, doesn't it? And where were you born?
In London.
And can you tell me a bit about your family?
My Chinese family, which I guess is what you're interested in, is has had a long relationship with the UK. So my great-grandfather first came to London in the 1860s, and that was during the period of self-strengthening in China, where after the Opium Wars, the really educated elites were very concerned with reform, not yet reforming philosophically or politically, but interested in, more than anything, technology and the development of Chinese technology. So he was sent here by the government to learn navigation at Greenwich Naval College. My maternal great-grandfather was sent to Paris to learn shipbuilding, and so they built the modern navy in Fuzhou, which was ultimately destroyed in one of the Japanese engagements. But he then, because of his great English, and because most of the top scholar officials in China couldn't speak English because it wasn't encouraged, he became the ambassador here. So he was the ambassador towards the end of the 19th century. And then subsequently many of the members of the family, the wider family, became diplomats of one kind or another, mainly because of their English training or their training in European languages. So my grandfather was here for a short while, and my father was here as a child, and went back, returning in 1936, after which he didn't return till after the Cultural Revolution. So it's in those years, from 1936 to the 80s, when he met my mother, who's English. She's a farmer's daughter. She was a farmer's daughter. And there are four of us, twin brothers, sister. And we grew up partly in London, partly in Surrey.
What work did your well, we know about your father, but what work did your mother do?
That's really interesting. She wasn't. She was a bit of a wild child, and she wasn't a academic by any stretch of the imagination. She came to London almost running away from the countryside, and worked in this area in Bloomsbury as a chambermaid originally. She'd studied domestic science, and she'd had a pretty good education at Bedford High School. They were rich farmers, so she wasn't poor. But she was clearly not wanting to fit the traditional mould of her family in Bedfordshire. And then she fell in with, through the domestic science, with Egon Ronne, who was the editor of the Good Food Guide. So she did a cordon bleu training, and worked in restaurants. And it's at that time that she met my father, and they did some culinary events. My father at that time probably was beginning a PhD in London University. And so they used to put on multicultural events at the Union. So what was her work, actually? Her work was... My father was far too aristocratic to work, really. He tried lots of businesses, and one particular... He was a tennis blue. He was a North China champion in tennis, and had come with the Olympic team in 1936 to Europe. But he didn't have much taste for hard work and always wanted to be a writer. He'd been at Cambridge during the 30s with many famous writers and had aspirations to be a poet, and life was pretty tough because, having been extremely wealthy, he was suddenly extremely poor. He tried always to be a writer in his early years, but he was a good poet, but not a great poet by any means. So my mother had to work and had to look after 4 children. And increasingly lost family money, what there was. She ran, when we were young, she had to make money and work for it, so she was the head of school meals in Epsom. So she used to put out 1,000 meals a day in our kitchens and then come home and cook for us. So life was very tough for her. And Dad was always on the tennis court. So you can see there were certain tensions in the household.
So they had quite opposite backgrounds, but different backgrounds?
Well, obviously, culturally there were different backgrounds. As I said, my mother wasn't poor when she was growing up. They had a big farm in Bedfordshire, but actually her father had died, and they were rather done out of that farm. So both families had... Both of them were cut off from family wealth and had to rely on themselves. They were... Politically, they were very interesting because my father came from a family that would naturally have been Republican. And, were very much... Some of them very much involved with the Republican government. My father was consul for the Chinese seamen in Liverpool for the Chongqing government. But... because he was trained, because he'd known, when he was at Yenjing University, now on the Peking University campus, half of his friends were Republicans and half of them were on their way to Yan'an, so they were communist sympathisers. When he arrived in 1930s, Cambridge, it was Spanish Civil War times, so many of the intellectuals he was hanging out with were very left-wing. So he was always a Labour voter. And so they were part of a sort of young socialist crowd in London. And he used to write for... he worked for the New Statesman, I think, but more for the editor who was also putting out Eastern Eye, which was a sort of soft socialist... Actually CIA funded, it transpired, but he didn't know at the time. Soft left, elite, academic Chinese kind of publication, news about Asia.
And for yourself, what education did you have?
It was interesting because really coming from the families and the education that they'd come from, they should have valued education. And most Chinese families do. You see young Chinese who come from working class families doing extremely well here. My parents were, being slightly left-wing, were very invested in state education as the right thing to do. Also the convenient thing to do if you didn't have any money. So I did have... I was Montessori educated as a young child in Hampstead when they still had some money, and then privately educated in a small private school in Leatherhead, and then went into a grammar school. So I was basically grammar school educated. I left after my GCSEs, and I did my A-levels in the college, City and East London College of Further Education, not a very salubrious establishment, in Old Street, which is very fashionable at the moment, but it wasn't then. was full of strip clubs. And I'd pretty much run away from home by then. And then what happened? Then I studied martial arts, and that was my love, and I went out to work. And through martial arts, got involved in acupuncture. So for 10 years, that was my life. And then at 30, I decided I needed further education, or further education, and applied to Cambridge and strangely got in because I hadn't, as a mature student, I hadn't achieved at all. I mean, I was a wild teenager, so the fact that the grammar school taught me anything is much to their credit. I rarely went to school, and my life was full of much sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So at 30, I got serious, and I did feel the weight of a scholarly Confucian background, or at least I felt the weight of my ancestors at some point in those years, and I thought, well, I'd better achieve something. And I was interested in Chinese studies. I wasn't a Chinese language speaker as a young person. So strangely, almost everything that I've learnt has had a Chinese root or a Chinese tradition has been from non-Chinese people, because the people training us in Cambridge were not Chinese. Similarly, in acupuncture, the people who trained me were not Chinese initially. So it's an odd kind of, because at that time it was still, Cambridge was sending their students to Taiwan. Maybe SOAS was going to the mainland, but essentially it wasn't that simple, and especially because I'd already got 3 children. So life was quite tough, actually, in those years. No money, too many children. I'd set up an acupuncture centre by then. It was a big acupuncture centre. In fact, I did that around my early 20s. In fact, I think it was the biggest acupuncture centre in Europe. We had 7 rooms in Waterloo and 24 practitioners who were working in a kind of cooperative style. It was a very interesting period. So then I went on to do a PhD in SOAS and a research fellowship at SOAS too. I was a long time in SOAS, and have been working in UCL since then.
And which martial art was it that you first started?
I first started Tai Chi, actually, and this was as a result of my father tearing his hair out about my future and what I was going to do. So he introduced me to an Australian Tai Chi teacher, and I studied with her very intensively between about 15 and 18, maybe. But I also, at the same time, did Wado-ryu karate, Goju-ryu karate, Shindo karate, all with non-Asians. This was European masters or European teachers. I did many forms of Tai Chi as a young person here, and then with some Hong Kong teachers. At that time, mostly Yang style. These days, I do mostly Chen style. And I did yoga and anything that was going, actually, and pretty intensively. Yeah.
And can you tell us what your current position is and your main areas of research?
Okay, so I'm the director of a new centre at the which is called the China Centre for Health and Humanity, and that's in the history department at UCL, where I'm a senior lecturer. And I teach all kinds of crazy things. I teach just this year I've started a straight history course in ancient and medieval China. I convene a master's programme that is concerned with the Chinese medical humanities. And what we do is we look at interdisciplinary approaches to Chinese health. So we look at population studies, we look at history, we look at anthropology, climate change, old age, all kinds of things. And then I have a very lively Chinese film and the body course where we look at Chinese film from those angles. So we look at disability and we look at public health, AIDS, death, martial arts, different constructions of the body, forensic body, sort of CSI Chinese style. So we that's really fun. Last night we watched a film called Gua Sha, which was looking at Gua Sha is a technique for improving the circulation, which involves leaving. Well, the technique is not painful, but it marks the whole of the back. Scraping. Yeah. Okay. So basically, it's a story about intercultural misunderstandings and a grandfather who gives his grandson gua sha, and then the family get pulled up by the social services in China for child abuse. So that kind of thing we look at.
And how did you become interested in this area of study?
Which one of them? Are we talking about acupuncture? Are we talking about history? Are we talking about medical humanities or film studies?
I guess that sort of transition from acupuncture to history.
Why did I become an academic? I think and take on Chinese studies, which is what I did at Cambridge and SOAS. Okay, so there I was, an acupuncturist, and I had been taught theories of Chinese medicine, but I was always dissatisfied with the way I'd been taught them, and so I just wanted to do the history, and I wanted to be able to speak Chinese, and I wanted to be able to understand how Chinese practitioners, how they understood what they were doing, because I had grown up in a community of non-Chinese mainly. I mean, most of the Chinese that I came into contact with were through my father's culinary engagements in the restaurants, etc. So they weren't my friends, contemporaries. You know, they were either people working or so the contact was limited, and because there was a kind of Orientalism in my environment, and Dad was involved with Arthur Whaley and various people who were sinologists, you know, the famous sinologists of his period, having been in Cambridge and living in sort of NW3, which was where many of them were. So there was a background of scholarly interest in China. My father had imported Chinese art and handicrafts, and so I'd been brought up around material culture of China and the food culture of China, but I really felt dissatisfied that I didn't understand this medicine thing. Medicine wasn't an obvious choice for me because Chinese scholarly families do not really go into medicine. It's certainly not in the 20th century as one of their professions of choice. So what's quite interesting is how middle-class Europeans became interested in Chinese medicine through their fantasies, really, about China. And so I was very much engaged with that. Young people as well, and part of the alternative world, people who were rejecting the straight professions. So that was really my entry point, but I had this added kind of Chinese cultural background without any language. So talk about confused identities. So I made the transition because I was dissatisfied with the sort of interpretations of Chinese medicine that I was getting on the one hand, but on the other hand I was very engaged with it because it proved to me an effective practice and an appropriate practice for the world that I was living in. So I did a form of Chinese medicine which was acupuncture, and that was interesting really too, because acupuncture really is the lowest class of the Chinese medical professions, or maybe with massage as well, in China. But because there was very little Chinese herbal trade in the 1980s, and what there was concentrated in the Chinese community, so it was delivered through Chinatown and to Chinese patients, and the odd brave European who would venture in there looking for either cure or following their interest in things Chinese. So what we had was acupuncture, and so we changed its social dimensions by basically being often people in those colleges during the 1980s, late 70s and 80s, were often people in second profession. I was the youngest person in my college, having signed in at 17 years old. Most of them were mature people who had decided to leave a profession and take up acupuncture training. So I was very aware of the contradictions of that world, and wanted something higher quality. And I thought that, I suppose, actually, I had not really made a choice to become a Chinese medical practitioner. My father had delivered me into the hands of this Australian Tai Chi teacher, and I had become a sort of protege of her. And she took me to the acupuncture college, and they almost signed me up as I walked through the door. So I fell into acupuncture. And in a way, going back into academia was more where I wanted to be. My uncle, who was a teacher of classical Chinese in Columbia University, had been quite instrumental in encouraging me to read classical Chinese. He used to come once a year and give me a couple of lessons. And he would tell me stories, all kinds of stories. So I had a lot of stories from my father, and his brothers. And so I didn't know what to do with those stories when I was young. I had nothing to hang them on, no serious historical training or whatever. So essentially, I was a bit bored with my father's stories, but I didn't. He was a bit repetitive, and so I had also had a copy of Journey to the West as a child, so it was sort of infused with monkey and those stories. So it was exciting to me too. So going to Cambridge was a fulfilment of the need to really pad out my own history.
And that was the college in Old Street?
No, I went. That was. So why did you ask me why I'd made the transition from acupuncture to further education, and that was Cambridge. Further education is just where I did. The college in London was where I did my A levels.
And then where did you do the acupuncture course?
The acupuncture course when I was 17 was in Leamington Spa. So that was a very interesting institution. It was run by a man who styled himself as Professor Worsley, Jack Worsley. And the school was titled the School of the Leamington School of Traditional Chinese Medicine. And they are famous for having delivered a style of acupuncture called 5-element acupuncture. Now, that's very complex because as time went by and I met a lot more Chinese practitioners, as I was involved in China and Chinese medicine in China, this school was anomalous because nobody calls themselves 5-element acupuncture in China, and Chinese people don't really understand what it is that Europeans are doing. So this is a kind of cultural conflict which became very vivid at the point at which acupuncture and Chinese medicine was attempting to represent itself as a unified entity for legitimization. So it's for legitimation and for recognition by government and formal recognition in the UK. can talk forever about that. But it's quite complicated, But what I can say about that school was Professor Worsley was eclectic in the way he understood what Chinese medicine was and in the way he delivered it. And if I analyse it now, I can see what happened was they learnt a very pure and rather simple form of ancient Chinese philosophy and simplified the classical understandings of what Chinese medicine was. And then they added in a lot of what was emerging in the 70s and 80s from psychotherapy, from osteopathy, from homeopathy, and fused it all together into a very interesting hybrid medicine that was very attractive both to those of us that were studying at that time, but also to patients. Because when we delivered it, we would use these theories of yin and yang and the 5 phases or the 5 agents, and we would deliver it psychotherapeutic style. So he concentrated very much on the disorders of our emotional lives. So we'd ask people about their emotional lives. Now, this is not something that you see Chinese medical practitioners doing in any great depth. They do ask, but it was a style. It was a point of concentration for those early acupuncturists in the 70s and 80s, and it survives today. It's become rather influential today in a sort of cultish sort of way, and it was taught in that sort of that triangular way that cults emerge. So with some secrecy about what information was imparted at different stages of your training, and I mean, I guess not unlike pre-communist styles of Chinese medicine in China, which were taught in families and in restricted ways. So it was very interesting, and a phenomenon that was very appropriate in its own time, and was very attractive to people who wanted to talk about their illnesses. Those people who were not being... There were several types of patients. There were those... I first started working in Coventry, and I had quite a big practice in Coventry. I was very young, now I think unspeakably young, 20 or 21 or so. And it was a part-time course, so it doesn't match up to any of the current courses that were on offer. It was a women's world. I think there were more women registered as acupuncturists because it was one of those professions that you could do part-time and you could shape it around having families, etc. And it was attractive to women because it was sort of auxiliary medicine of some kind. So anyway, I graduated around when I was 21 and set up a practice in London. There was very few Chinese in the college in Leamington Spa, and those Chinese would have been the ones that I remember. The Asians that I remember weren't even Chinese, actually. They were Malaysians and rather non-characteristically Chinese, and very middle class. So those that were working within European worlds. So so I worked in London with a glorious mix of people, and mostly women, a lot of gay men, and our patients were... my patients in Coventry were very different to my London patients. My patients in Coventry were mostly working class or Indian, Pakistani. So I think the reasons why Indians and Pakistanis might come to acupuncture are very different to why working class white people would come to acupuncture. Normally, well, many of those patients were the white UK patients were basically suffering from symptoms that were not getting any help from the GP. So it was out of desperation that they came. And many of those symptoms were ones which were quite easily addressed with acupuncture at the time where I found it. So headaches and backaches and strokes and psychological issues, menstruation, pain in menstruation, women's problems generally, energy, depression, madness. I kind of cut my teeth just with... It was explorative. I don't think that, when I think back, that I was really very well qualified. I certainly, if I was thinking from my own position now, I would want a lot more training before I sort of hit the clinic. But actually I found, and my patients clearly found some benefit at that time. And there were many miracles. You know, Chinese medicine sells itself through its miracle treatments, and there were many, you know, people who got up and walked off my couch and who'd had major strokes. So it's strange, and you know, those critics, those people who are cynical will say, oh, it's all placebo, but if it's all placebo, placebo's a wonderful medicine. And do I believe that there's efficacy in Chinese medicine? Of course I do. But it's an art form, and it's only ever as good as the practitioner is. Which makes it impossible to test.
And do you think it was your Chinese cultural background that led you to become dissatisfied with the way you were being taught and the way it was being practiced in the UK?
You know, I felt it possibly easier than other people to consider, to reflect on the possibility of learning Chinese, you know, because that's such a big undertaking, as you well know, that you know, most practitioners who, after all, were older than me, the ones surrounding me, would have found it much too difficult. Many of them were very interested in early Chinese philosophy and took on the study of classical Chinese as a kind of part-time activity. And certainly there is something about scholarly Chinese medicine that demands that you engage philosophically with the world of Chinese medicine. And many of them did, to their credit, and worked hard at it. But they tend to study the philosophers of the Warring States and the Neijing, the classical works of Chinese medicine, and not really engage with how Chinese medicine changed in China over 2 millennia, which is massive. You know, Chinese medicine that I now study in the early worlds is not the kind of Chinese medicine that we would want to be starting practicing here, either in China or in Europe. You know, it was a whole great array of different surgical techniques and ritual, what would be considered ritual magic now. So it's very different to how we imagined in Leamington Spa in those early years.
Well, it's none of it simple, but with the medicine, with like, just to describe the main features of Chinese medicine, how it works, say today, and then we could go and talk about the past as well.
Okay, so what do I think Chinese medicine is? I'll just give you a brief overview of Chinese medicine, yeah? In the contemporary world. Okay, well, Chinese medicine is made up of an enormous number of techniques, and some are more prevalent in different geographic regions than others. So in Chinese medicine in the UK, Chinese medicine really was acupuncture until China opened up in the 1980s, and since then there's been a great deal of herbal trade. Well, herbs are not just herbs. Herbs also include minerals, and as well as plant materials. And there are many other techniques like massage, gua sha, which is kind of scraping, cupping, ear acupuncture, and when you're in China and around the Chinese medical establishments. There's any number of techniques that I don't even understand now. So in Britain, we had acupuncture, and acupuncture is delivered through acupuncture clinics. There's also acupuncture that's on offer in hospitals for pain, in pain clinics specifically. Some GP practices that can buy in, they can buy in practitioners to service their patient community, and that's been happening for a long time. And they will be doing a more general practice rather than just pain treatments. What's very interesting is that, of course, before modern biomedicine, Chinese medicine there was no Chinese medicine, it was just medicine. Medicine in China was used to treat all manner of emergency and chronic treatments. But in the West, it's become a treatment mainly for chronic ailments, because it's the chronic ailments that what you get done at the GP is so bad at. So arthritis and backache and headaches, very high, and menstrual problems, things that actually people suffer with as a matter of course in their lives, and Chinese medicine has, people say it's good for that, and my experience is also that it's good. But previously in pre-modern China, people would be seeking out medical practitioners and what we now know as Chinese medicine for emergencies, for cardiac emergencies, for strokes, for viral infections, etc. So it was an emergency medicine in the past, and it's only because of this kind of interface with biomedicine that's become a medicine for chronic. Because now it would be unethical not to send somebody to emergency who had an emergency condition. You can't not do that. So by default, Chinese medicine becomes the treatment of chronic diseases. So its transmission, its re-emergence in the modern world has been shaped by its relationship with biomedicine. I think it has a great future, partly because what we're all going to be suffering from in old age are all these chronic ailments. So either we're going to be taking glorious concoctions of drugs, or we're going to be looking for other alternative forms of palliative care. And there's nothing like Chinese massage. And one of the great things about Chinese massage is that it is not so much subjective to evidence, because the thing is, it's a whole panoply of techniques which have immediate efficacy in terms of reducing stress or reducing pain, etc. It's really, that really is a sort of microcosm of the whole Chinese problem, the Chinese medicine problem, is you can't isolate out a single technique and say that's Chinese medicine, because Chinese medicine is the art of compositing different techniques to an individual's problem. Okay, and I think that would... No, you can take out simple drugs, single drugs, because there's plenty of those in the Chinese materia medica. So one drug is good for one symptom, and you can test that. But that, in a way, is not Chinese medicine. It's just medicine. That's what you do in biomedicine. You look for substances, and then you isolate out the effective elements of that substance. But and there are plenty of those in Chinese medicine. There are plenty of plants that are one-to-one, and they rather lend themselves to testing. But the big problem with Chinese medicine in the modern world is that it's a concoction. Even the Chinese medical soup that's created by compositing lots of different substances has effective elements that work together in ways that it's almost impossible to test. This kind of polypharmacy. And not only that you composite all these things, but you change them every time you see them. Every time a practitioner sees a patient, that concoction changes. Okay, so the whole evidence machine relies on being able to standardise a treatment, being able to standardise somebody's symptoms or treat the same symptom in different people. So it just doesn't work. And there are various fields where more complex interactions are beginning to be tested, but it's a very expensive process which will take 1,000,000 years to really test all of the Chinese medical combinations that are used to treat an individual patient. So,
how does the kind of the practice and the philosophy sort of crucially, how are they crucially different between the West biomedicine and Chinese medicine?
in theory, ideally, biomedical treatments in modern medical practice should all be grounded in this evidence base, and but actually, to what extent it's true and to what extent it's possible has to be very much questioned. But in theory, that's how it should be. In Chinese medicine, as I've just described, it's extremely difficult to test the combination of techniques. You can only test, in a sense, the person and their skill in that combination, skill in practice. In many respects, Chinese medicine and Western medicine, which is a strange kind of identification in a way, because there's plenty of Western medicine in China and plenty of Western medicine has been created in China. So these West-East kind of things, polarities are not really appropriate. But they share many perceptions. So, but Chinese medicine as a tradition is always taught through a philosophy and with a philosophic background, with this notion of qi, and it's that really that sets it apart, the idea that it has a theoretical base, and which is generally, often unacceptable to a modern public. So what they want to see is only those elements that come up to scratch within modern biomedical framework. So yin, yang, the 5 phases, the 5 agents are very far from a modern medical training. Okay, so what is different? What is basically different about Chinese and European biomedicine? I mean, what comes before biomedicine is in some ways very similar in Europe to Chinese medical practice. It's ideas based on notions of physiology to do with the humours, to do with the way the body interacts with its environment. One of the things that is really attractive to the European public that are convinced by Chinese medicine is how the body is seen as a microcosm of the macrocosm. So how the body is seen to be made up of a qi that also powers the universe and all the transformations in the universe. And it's very attractive, really, to people involved in environmental politics and the idea that one should live in tune with the seasons, that one should live in tune with the world around, and that there are ways through training this notion of qi that can bring you back to health. And the notion of harmony is very much part of the modern understanding, harmonizing the body, of the modern understanding of Chinese medicine, and it resonates in very different ways. It was rather different in the past. They talked about we talk about balance now because we feel our bodies and our minds are unbalanced, our lives are unbalanced, and find in Chinese medicine something rather beautiful to support those ideas, and that we can integrate medicine and the way we live our lives into that philosophy is very attractive. And the other thing, and I think that what remains very attractive about Chinese medicine is how it is empowering. So a good practitioner will engage with you about how you live your life. And I'm not saying that your GP won't do that, but he will be doing that within a certain frame whereby you have to eat in a way that has been established as universally good for everybody. Whereas Chinese medicine is typically delivered as a personalised medicine. So you have to understand where that person is in their lives, what sort of constitution their body has, and tailor a diet, an exercise plan, a life plan, a sleeping plan to that individual and that individual skills, capacities, weaknesses, etc. And once a patient has some sort of understanding, they are then empowered themselves to change their life towards a healthy plan, and that's quite different because it's personalised to that individual.
And so when Chinese medicine was developing, and it kind of went in a different direction than the sort of Western conceptions of humours and things, how did it change over time?
So how is it different from the very early notions of Chinese medicine? I mean, Chinese medicine really, what we think of as Chinese medicine, its sources are really in the late Warring States and early Han period. So we're talking about 2,000 years or so ago. There were many changes over time. I mean, first of all, there was this notion that there was qi in the body, and that's really talking about vitality and strength and how the sort of fluids or this qi running through the body can get impeded, how it can get blocked, how it can get full or weak, etc. And strangely, it was really with the coming of the empire in 220 BC that it began to get standardized, and you get this notion of channels running through the body. Those channels are eerily like the communication pathways of China as an empire, and the idea of blockages in the body is strangely like the notion of in China everything was being standardized at that time, weights and measures for taxation and commerce, roads and wheel and track sizes so that the armies could move around China. The channels of acupuncture were mapped in some of those earliest records to the rivers of China, so the whole body was a sort of representative of empire and state, which makes it rather difficult to imagine why it's still relevant, why people still find it relevant today. But I think in many ways the theories are rather simple, and they can be moulded to different people's ideas at different times. In later periods, you have the idea of cold damage, which is a very important theory in early China. You have other theories emerging in early modern times to do with infectious diseases and warmth factor diseases. There are many different styles of acupuncture around the Songjin and Yuan period, which people are promoting. So one particular family or one particular practitioner and his disciples would be concerned with the spleen, and the spleen is the major cause of illness, so weakness of the spleen. So there would be particular concoctions and particular treatments that were geared towards that. and so each lineage of medical practitioners might come up with a slightly different approach to the treatment of the body. Over the centuries, each drug, each herb, each mineral would be attributed various potencies. So those potencies would be concocted in different ways in order to address different types of illness. Probably the most radical change came in the 20th century, when that scholarly lineage or master-disciple lineage of treatment changed into, really as a result of the coming of biomedicine. It's often conflict and the fight for survival that actually brings together, almost galvanizes practitioners to fight back. And so during the 20s and 30s, Chinese medical societies developed, journals developed, schools of acupuncture began to develop their own ways of disseminating their information in modern ways. So by the communist times and in the 1950s, with Mao's support, new institutions evolved, so that what you've had was schools of acupuncture and really the democratization of knowledge, but anyway, knowledge being provided for everybody rather than within closed lineages. So most professional lineages, whereas there's a skill involved, has a certain kind of privacy about it, because what you're selling is privileged information. Whereas within the institutions of communist China, it was knowledge for everybody, and that was after really a Western model of education that was developing at that time. So then what you get is standardized knowledge, whereas in the past that knowledge would be focused through an individual, so and their skills and their range of skills. So it was an art being taught, a skill being taught, rather than a body of knowledge being delivered in written forms, in textbooks, and in modern teaching methods. And that changes the nature of the medicine completely.
So that how did that affect any differences in development, like in mainland China compare with Taiwan and Hong Kong?
That I'm not very sure of, actually. There's one scholar called Kim Taylor who will say, yes, okay, so what you can say is that, Kim Taylor would say that it survived in China simply because of the political support, and because Mao decided, really with the withdrawal of Soviet support and financing of the medical infrastructure, Mao was left without any resources, or with very poor resources for developing medical care in China. So he turned everything on its head, really, and promoted Chinese medical practitioners above Western-trained biomedical practitioners, and set up institutions supporting traditional medicine. He had made a promise to the traditional medical practitioners that he would support them after the revolution, as he was trying to recruit people into the Red Army and to support the communist cause. So he owed them that promise. But it was also because he was rather suspicious of Western-educated people anyway, not having had a Western education himself. And so he had this kind of... he said, famously, Chinese medicine is a great treasure house in the 1950s, I think late 50s, and poured a lot of political support into the development of it. So Chinese medicine became institutionalized, whereas in Hong Kong and Taiwan in those early years, it didn't receive the same kind of government support, so it maintained its power more in the grassroots. So through, eminent practitioners who had trained probably from individual teachers. That still happened in China, but because it happened a lot within institutions rather than through families and in this master-disciple sort of way. Kim would say, she's not a colleague of mine, she would say that the only reason Chinese medicine survived and has become so influential is because of Mao's support and the continuing support in China. But it's actually pretty vivid all around the world outside of that institutional backing. Now, actually, Chinese medicine is getting a lot of support from the Chinese government, and that's partly sort of soft power, and it's because it is so popular. And one has to question its continuing popularity globally. Why is that happening? What has it got that it's delivering to people that they find in Africa, South America, in Cuba, so effective?
And in those other countries, are they similar to the UK in the fact that there was a kind of a domestic development of the medicine by sort of foreigners, as it were, who were interested in it?
Yeah, well, I think that can certainly be said about America. The New Age world, within which there's a certain orientalizing, made something new and creative with Chinese medicine. And I don't say it's invalid because it was new and creative, but it's just different. That's certainly the case in South America. That there pre-existed certain types of indigenous interest rather than Chinese migrationary. But then it's mixed really, because there were so many Chinese in South America and in America working on the railroads, working on the sugar plantations, that they brought with them their traditional remedies. But that's and the European development and interest in Chinese medicine is something separate. Those worlds didn't really interact very much until more recently. And now we have university courses where Chinese practitioners are very much in evidence, teaching what would be, which is pretty much a modern standardized form of Chinese medicine that has developed in communist China. But then again, you also get Taiwanese practitioners and Hong Kong practitioners who haven't quite been through the same experience of mainland Chinese sort of teaching and standardization. Chinese medicine, of course, came much earlier to Britain in the end of the 18th and through the 19th centuries. And many, most of that conduit for the arrival of Chinese medicine was the people involved were those surgeons and doctors that were in the Dutch East India companies and around Japan, and receiving Chinese styles medicine through Japan as well as in China. And they were very fascinated with specific things like the pulses, because at that time pulse was very important in Europe as well. So they were very interested in the fact that there were 28 different qualities of the Chinese pulse. They were also interested in the very obvious miracles of Chinese medicine. So in moxibustion, cure for gout. So there would be one or two treatments that they pick up and use to great effect, and then introduce to the Royal Society. And I can give you details of all those another time. So it had been around in different phases. It was also very interesting to those people involved in clinical medicine's laboratory trials in the 18th century. So I'll give you that information as well. But those are other stories, really.
Come back to the different practitioners in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and mainland China. Does that is that very evident in sort of practitioners today? I mean, you've mentioned in the teaching, but is there kind of, what are their relationships like in their
Taiwan,
practice
Hong
here?
Kong and China, I haven't really been in the same environment with practitioners that have come, in one environment where there are, because actually the Middlesex University, for example, those Chinese practitioners in University of Westminster that on the new courses tend to be mainland Chinese, is my impression. And it's certainly the case that since the 1980s, those have been the most powerful practitioners, most involved in the setting up of the new societies, because they represent the largest number of practitioners, whereas the Hong Kong practitioners would have been here earlier, and would have had the sort of traditional Soho kinds of shops, and that's very interesting in the way that. So how did they interact with the incoming mainland Chinese? I don't really know, and that's a question for some of the heads of the Chinese societies more than anything. My impression is that there's quite a lot of conflict between the different societies, both the British Acupuncture Society, the ATCM, and the other ones, which I think you've got on that list. They represent different groups of Chinese as they've arrived. What I think is really interesting about Chinese migration to the UK is that it's always been about health in some kind of way, or about servicing the body in some sort of way, whether it's laundries, about hygiene, whether it's martial arts in physical practice, whether it's Chinese restaurants where they're feeding people, and now Chinese medicine. All of it shows a certain kind of economic migration, which takes a certain form. That's the high street shop, or the high street restaurant, etc. There's a kind of economic structure to it that is the same, has the same sort of rationale. Nobody else can deliver this. It's uniquely, culturally Chinese. Laundries perhaps not so much, but anyway, the high street, readily available servicing of the body is core to that, and that changed the nature of Chinese medicine and the nature of the customers, demographic groups involved, in a radical way from the European practitioners that were there before, who would work in more kind of alternative medical worlds, in community centres, in around the yoga phenomenon, and that's the mainland Chinese, and they are split, it seems, into those practitioners that have been qualified from the top TCM colleges in China, and those that inhabit the shops themselves. So there's an overlap. But in the early years, a lot of practitioners came from those top colleges, but were held in very tight contracts and had to work out their contracts in quite difficult circumstances. But then I hear, well, of course there was a major... No, you asked me about Hong Kong, Taiwan. I don't really know is the answer to that. I just know that the Hong Kong ones were here before. Hong Kong practitioners were here before, and then the 1980s and the 90s particularly saw this mass migration of and people, and the practitioners in their shops. A lot of them are medically qualified and were primarily biomedical doctors, but found that they couldn't practice here for various reasons, because of language or because of they don't have acceptable qualifications. So they turned to, and all of them were trained biomedical. Chinese mainland biomedical doctors all have some training in Chinese medicine. So it was an easier trade to ply here, and clearly serviced the needs of people who wanted drop-in health wanted drop-in medicine, who could just wander in and get their headache cured in some way or treated in some way. Yeah.
And could you just describe in brief the main practices? I mean, obviously they differ from different practitioners, but the main practices that are used today in Chinese medicine, and just what they are and how they work, or how they the sort of thinking behind them.
Okay, well, most of the Chinese practices, whether they be acupuncture, moxibustion, gua sha, cupping, electrical acupuncture, massage, are all aiming to move the qi, strengthen the qi, smooth the qi, and that qi can become tense. It's the body is imagined with the balance between yang and yin, and so yang and yin. Yang represents the hot, the bright, the intense, whereas yin represents the cooler, the downward flowing rather than the upward flowing movements in the body. And it's all about striking a certain harmony for an individual. And so when a practitioner is massaging, they are cognizant of the movements of qi in the body, and will be aiming to redress either a weakness or a blockage or an imbalance in the body. Similarly with dietary therapy and with Chinese medicine, the body can be too hot, too cold. It can be weak, and it can be the qi can be the movement of qi through the body can become blocked or move in the wrong direction. So all of the techniques are really aimed at that, and at weaknesses in the organs, the inner organs. The organs are related to the channels, but the organs themselves are not really conceived of so much as physical masses. It's more that each one has a function in the body. And its condition is expressed through the pulses. The pulses mainly at the wrist, but there are many other pulses in the neck and the ankles, which reveal the quality of qi in the channels. So that's the belief that all of these all of these techniques are grounded in.
What's the most enjoyable part of your work researching Chinese traditional medicine?
The research or my practice?
Or your practice as an acupuncturist and your research, but what is it that you find most enjoyable about your work with TCM?
Okay. I should say that I don't practice so much anymore, because finally, actually, in this last couple of years, I accept that I am an academic, and that really takes up most of my time. But really, I have practiced continuously since I was 17. That's 40 years. I think when I see a patient getting better and becoming more in charge of their own health, one thing that I haven't said is that my own research brought out the degree to which this notion of qi, which seems a bit strange to the modern eye, is about a sensory experience of the body. So when people talk about their qi being weak or their qi being strong or stuffed up in their head or whatever, what they're really talking about is how they're experiencing their own health. And I think that one of the beauties of treating patients is watching how people get more and more aware of the minor changes in the way that they feel in their sickness or even in their health, that their health can be either better or worse on a particular day, but that they can do things that will change that state, whether that involves doing some martial arts or whether it involves going to see the acupuncturist, or eating differently, sleeping differently, etc. So on the one hand, it is about that really most important thing, taking charge of your health, and that's so important as we're growing older, as the treatments down at the GP do not help unless without sort of making you reliant on a panoply of drugs. So it gives you autonomy. It gives you the ability to be involved in your health. It's empowering in ways that often coming up against a biomedical institution is disempowering. So that's what I really enjoy, and that's actually what links my practice and my joy as a practitioner to my joy in research, because that's what I've found from the most ancient of manuscripts. The first treatise on therapeutic exercise, which I translate, and the first treatise on acupuncture.
And what's the most challenging aspect of practicing, or that you've seen in researching practitioners?
I suppose that I work within UCL, which is an institution wherein there have been terrible witch hunts against alternative medical practitioners in a very ignorant sort of way, I would say. There's no sophistication in understanding the meaning of Chinese medicine, both to practitioners and patients, and why it is so attractive and effective, because it is attractive. It's meeting a need in the modern world, and it's. I mean, there are many people in UCL who are interested, but I think this sort of notion that there is patient experience and patient experience is belittled, and that notion that personalised medicine is not important. All we're looking for is a magic bullet and a universal treatment. And I have no problem with the miracles of biomedicine at all, and see very clearly how essential they are in the world. So it's just that there are whole swathes of experience and efficacy that are not explained by narrow approaches to evidence.
That's great. I think that's my kind of last question. But do you have anything else you'd like to?
I think for the essay, what's probably most important is looking at the legislations, and I'll have to give you dates and impacts. So, what's completely going to transform the nature of Chinese medicine on the high street is that the patent medicines have been outlawed as a result of European-wide legislation. So what that means is that Chinese herbal medicines are the practitioners are still able to sell loose herbs, but they cannot sell the formulas unless the formulas have been through the licensing of the standard licensing of drugs in the UK. So that means that they have to prescribe the prepared drugs, not the prepared drugs. They have to be able to prepare and mix the drugs themselves and write the classical prescriptions. One of the problems there is that European patients don't like to boil and drink Chinese medicines because they're bitter, because it takes time, and people like quick and easy solutions. So it troubles me that may die, because it would be nice to see the world of loose herbs flourish, but I'm not sure that it will. So what happens then in the... so they fall back on acupuncture, so acupuncture is still okay, one can practice acupuncture, and massage. And of course the massage elements then turn very easily into prostitution, which is a reality of the shops on our high streets probably. It's certainly a reality in China. So the more that the practitioners are limited in the techniques that they can employ, the worse things are. And the other thing is that it is true that there should... I believe that there should be more testing of the products, of the pre-prepared products, the formula, because some of those have been the source of some damage to patients. So long-term and wrong prescription, it has certainly been the case. On the other hand, I would say that it's not a level playing field. So the numbers of people that have been affected by these formula in no way compares to the numbers of people that become ill from just walking through the hospital doors, and they come out, 1 in 10 come out with illnesses they never had before. The numbers just don't stack up in terms of the Chinese medical world. So that whole area of legislation is one that we should look at, because it impacts very severely on the practitioners that are here.
Cool. Great. Wow. Thanks so much, Al. Thanks so much, Al. Thanks so much, Al. Thanks